Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to talk about some of the issues that I think about. And as a little treat, I brought my copies of my most recent book for free for anybody who wants it after the talk. And basically, in the book, what I talk about is technology is very powerful. And when you're in possession of a tool that's very powerful, it's a great question to ask what to do with this tool. And that question is actually not a technological question. It's a human question. And so in order to create great technologies, it requires also a great non-technological philosophy. It requires a philosophy of life. And the stronger and more differentiated and more compelling your philosophy of life is, the stronger, more differentiated, and more compelling the technology you will build with that as a foundation will be. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of that interplay today with a couple of examples, one of the examples being some of the work that I've done in education over the past couple of years. But a lot of it is more in detail expressed in the book. But I want to start with this wonderful calculation made in the 1970s by a radical Catholic priest named Ivan Illich. And Ivan Illich wanted to calculate the true speed of a car. And he said, in order to calculate the true speed of a car, you can't just take the distance that it travels and divide it by the time that it takes to get there. You also have to take into account the time that you have to work in order to afford the car, and the time that you sit in traffic in order to get to work, and so on and so forth. And he found that once you internalize all the externalities of a car, the true speed of a car is about 5 kilometers an hour. It's about walking speed. And this is crazy, and it's important. And he used this as an illustrative example of a philosophy that he called counterproductivity, where he said, technologies tend to bring efficiencies up until a certain point of application. But beyond that point of application, they tend to bring inefficiencies in the exact opposite direction of the purpose for which the technology was intended. And this is true not just for automobiles, but it's true for antibiotics and emails and so on and so forth. We live in an era of counterproductive technologies. And so I've thought a lot about this because I'd like to make technologies, and I would like the technologies to do what I want them to do. And the conclusion that I came to is that it's not technology per se that leads to counterproductivity. It's that we tend to build a certain kind of technology, a technology that I call self-reinforcing technologies, technologies whose use leads to more use. And the car is a great example of this. The car enables centralization of work and suburbs and highways, which then makes the car necessary, which then clogs the highways, and you know that you're in an addictive spiral when the remedy is more of the same, more highways and more cars. But it's possible, I think, to create a different kind of technology, a technology whose use doesn't lead to more use, but a technology whose use leads to less use, a technology that kicks off a social process that no longer needs the technology itself. And we see glimmers of this in some of our technologies today. An online dating site is a great example. If it works, you don't need to use it anymore. And so I started getting interested in the opposite of self-reinforcing technologies. I started getting interested in self-limiting technologies. And I was thinking about this a lot in around 2011, 2012, and I was living in San Francisco at the time. And I remember I was going on a walk trying to clear my head and thinking about this stuff, and I noticed that there was a lot of food trucks around, like more than there had been. And I was like, why are there so many food trucks, and why now? And so I started asking around, and I started asking the food trucks. And it turned out that it was because of Twitter. You see, at the time, it was very difficult to get a food truck license in San Francisco. But with Twitter, illegal food trucks could thrive because they'd park in a different spot every day and tweet out where they were. So they wouldn't get caught, but their customers would know where they were. And it gets better because at a certain point, the legal food trucks caught wind of this, took a look at the Twitter followers of the illegal food trucks and said, hey, this is a food truck customer database. And so they started following the followers of the illegal food trucks who followed them back. And this community formed around food trucks. And that community worked to shape, to work to change the regulations in San Francisco about food truck licensure. And this was fascinating to me because this was software shaping the city. It was the internet shaping physical space. Or to be more precise, it was software kicking off a social process that in turn shaped the city. And I got very interested because food trucks are like the cheapest and easiest way to shape a city. They're like the canaries in the coal mine. Like if it's happening with food trucks now, it's likely going to happen with lots of other things in the future. And so I started getting interested in how to think about software shaping the city and how to systematize this and how to kind of use the power that we have with software to help to shape more beautiful, more vibrant cities. And so I started with an experiment. In 2012, I went to the Media Lab, and I started by doing a show. I was invited to do a show at this museum called the Skissermnos Museum in Sweden. And so in the show, what I did is I wrote a number of programs that would give instructions to people in the museum to make marks on the wall. And together, the software and the people would create large-scale artworks. So in this program, we asked the first person to draw a circle, and then we asked each person following that to draw a circle tangent to an existing circle. And then, when there was no more space remaining, we asked people to color in the negative space. And so this is how that piece turned out. And so we did a number of these pieces. So we also, this is one that the instructions were the first few people drew lines, the second people drew lines from intersection points to other intersection points, the next people colored in space, the next people bisected space, and there was a series of instructions which generated this piece and pieces like this. This one, I asked the first person to draw a squiggly line, and then asked each person to draw a line exactly adjacent to an existing line. And in this one, I made a grid, a black and white grid, and asked each person to paste a polygon into the grid such that two sides match up. And so we did a number of these pieces. And in each of these pieces, basically, I followed the same process. I started by defining a pattern in physical space. Then I created a social process by which other people could create that or similar patterns. And then I created software to enable that social process. And I was very interested in this. And the wall drawings were intended to be a metaphor. I was interested in creating art, but I was even more interested in helping people to create the cities that they wanted to be in. So I started a second experiment. Where we had just moved to Cambridge, and our son was 2 years old at the time. And my wife said, "You have one job in this move, and it's to find a school for Dario." And I said, "That little I think I can do." And so I went and I looked at a whole bunch of schools, and I came back, and I told my wife, "I decided what we're going to do for schools. I'm going to start a school." She said that wasn't the assignment. She actually, at one point, she said, "You know, sometimes being married to you feels like being the sorcerer's apprentice in Fantasia. Like I have all this power to tell you what to do, but absolutely no control of what you're actually going to do." But she was cool with it, and I started a school, and the school was called Wildflower Montessori School, and there were 9 principles to the school. And I'll talk about a few of them right now. So the first principle is that it's a shopfront school. And this is not my idea, it's an idea that I got from Christopher Alexander, who's an architect, who wrote this beautiful book called A Pattern Language. And in this book, one of the patterns he observed in the 70s that, you know, about 30% of the cost of operating a school goes to the cost of operating a large school. And so he said, I have a simple solution. Make small schools. Two teachers, 20 children, put it in a shop front. And he said, not only you decrease the costs and increase the teacher autonomy, but you could also then put schools all over the city such that every child could walk to school. And he showed this research showing the benefits to learning from walking to school. So that's the first principle, is that it's a shopfront school. The second principle is it's a Montessori school. And the way that my two-sentence description of Montessori is that it's a philosophy of childhood that sees children not as blank slates to be filled up with knowledge, but as little people in the process of constructing themselves. And they have the ability to construct themselves. And so the teacher's role is to prepare the environment and to remove the obstacles for that important process of self-construction. So that's the second principle. It's a Montessori school. The third principle is that it's a lab school. And Montessori lends itself very well to being a lab school because Montessori is predicated on observation. So this is Maria Montessori back in the day, and you see her sitting back and observing the children doing their work. And when she found that there was an obstacle, then she would adjust the environment or connect a child to the environment. But observation was the primary principle by which Montessori lies. And you see this today. You see Montessori teachers today often will step back, sit in a corner, and observe and jot down their notes. And this is a very lovely tradition in Montessori. I think one of the challenges is that what you end up with is lots of notes. And it's difficult to do things like go back and synthesize those notes to have an overall understanding of the child, or to collect lots of these different notes among lots of different teachers to understand children in general. And so what we did is we created these sensors in the lab, and the sensors we put in the child's shoe. And so once the sensor is in the shoe, it just looks like a shoe, but it happens to have a sensor embedded inside. And so we not only put it in the shoe, but we also put it in the trays for the materials. And each Montessori material teaches a specific thing. So you start to get an understanding of the interaction between a child and a material. And then we also put it in different regions of the classroom. And because in a Montessori environment, each area of the classroom corresponds to a curriculum area. You have a math area, you have a language area, you have a practical life area. And so then what happens is that then the children go about and spend their day, and this is Wildflower, this is the first school, they spend their day in the classroom. And what's actually happening on the sensors front is the Bluetooth sensors are interacting with one another. And so we're gaining information about who each child interacts with, what materials they interact with, and what areas they're in. And then at the end of the day, the teacher uploads the data from the shoes. And it's always fun for me to see teachers uploading data from shoes. It feels very futuristic. And then they can review the data, but they also have, they can review the data in line, but they also have lots of data that they can review offline. And so then we feed this data into data visualization. So for example, we have a sense of how much time each child spends with each material each week. And this is very powerful because in Montessori, each material teaches a very specific thing. So when you know what materials each child is spending time with, you have a sense of what they're spending time learning. And then we also, the other thing about Montessori is each material falls into a curriculum area. So we can say over the course of the week how much time they spent in each curriculum area as compared to the rest of the classroom and the rest of all of the classrooms that are outfitted with these sensors. And we can do that not only over the course of the week, but we can do it over the course of the year. So you see, for example, this child is not interested in math until the end of the year where they get very interested in math. And then we can do fun things like impute the social network of the classroom by seeing who interacts with whom. And that's very important because Montessori is very peer learning based. They're mixed age classrooms, age 3 to 6, and a lot of times like a child will come ask a teacher for a presentation, and she says, that sounds like something that a friend can help you with. And so they tend to naturally go peer to peer. And so we can understand not just the social network of the classroom, but how learning gets diffused over that social network. And then we can do things like, once we have that, we can use tools that we know how to use. So for example, hidden Markov models to understand hidden states in a child and how they get observed in the materials that they're working on or behaviors that they're exhibiting. And we can also do things like, on the social network of the classroom, do PageRank-like algorithms to understand the influence of each child. So that's the third principle, is that it's a lab school. Long-winded third principle. The fourth principle is, I feel like children have so much to learn from seeing adults in their work. And adults have so much to learn from children being around. But right now, as a society, we tend to separate out adults and children and then bring them together for a short period of time at the end of the day. So here, what we do is the school has an artist in residence who has a studio in the school so that children have access to an adult doing the work of her life. And this is Kim, who is the artist in residence at Wildflower the first year, taking a break from her studio and coming out into the classroom and doing some work with Dario, my son. The fifth principle is I trained for 9 years after high school to become a professor. But my training to become a father consisted of reading like 3 books. And I felt like there was a mismatch between the importance of the job and the training that I had for it. And so I wanted a space not just for children to learn, but for parents to learn. And I wanted to blur the boundaries between homeschooling and institutional schooling and create a truly mixed-age learning environment. And so each parent spends a few hours a month in the classroom alongside their child, learning about Montessori, and also just learning about how their child spends their days and spending that time with their child. The sixth principle is that if you have a big school, you think about having kind of a playground and a cafeteria and so on. But with a small school, you can't have, or the single classroom school, you don't really have those things. So instead, we work to build the city to be friendlier to children and families. So for example, we took the 2 parking spots in front of Wildflower and made it into a park. And the coffee shop next door, we asked them to put a low table in the coffee shop so that the children could go have lunch at the coffee shop next door. And with both of these things, they were both space for the children of the school, but they ended up being spaces for children in the city in general. And so, all of these principles led to like a school experience that was really lovely for my child and my family. But I felt like if I did one, then it would be nice for these 20 families and the 20 families that would continue to go through it. But I felt like if I created many more of these, if I created thousands of these, well, it would be really a big service to the world. And so the question is, how do we go from one school to thousands of schools? Well, what we've done so far is we created a pattern in physical space. So the next thing we did was we created a social process by which other people could create similar schools. We open sourced the school, so to speak, the process for creating the school. Yes, James?
So, one thing that was really distinctive about your school was the technology to maybe record metrics of what's going on. Is that the key difference from other Montessori schools, or other? Because I would assume there's other Montessori schools that are small like this. Or is there other key characteristics that is important in the replication of going to 1,000? And then the part that I'm wondering about also is, since you have that data, like how was it used such that you know if you want to go replicate it?
So I think so. To answer your first question, there's a number of things that are pretty unique. Uh, there are a large number of other Montessori schools. There are very few shopfront Montessori schools. So the shopfront aspect is unique. The parent involvement, Montessori is a very precise method of education. So I remember I got into this long discussion with two teachers who were having a debate about the table washing material, the table washing exercise. And the debate was, should the child do it clockwise or counterclockwise? The scrubbing clockwise or counterclockwise? And actually, it's really important because uh, table scrubbing is actually a pre-writing exercise in Montessori. And so it's actually useful to do it in the way that they would most likely write cursive. And so that was a legitimate debate. But a lot of times when you have a method that's precise, and you have a parent come in like a bull in a china shop and say, good job, do this, do that, and so on. So by and large, the parent involvement is almost not at all there in Montessori. Yeah.
It's very similar to co-op.
That's right, that's right. So there are very few Montessori co-ops, and so kind of doing that right is a challenging thing. It requires a lot of parent education. So that's another thing. A third is that very few schools see as their mission to shape the neighborhood around them. So each of these principles has its distinct, its uniqueness. And so it was more than just the Montessori. It was also kind of just systematizing how to start any school is tremendously valuable, because when I started Wildflower, I was shooting blind, and now I have these this is how you get licensed. This is what to look for in a space. This is the number of square foot per child. This is the cost, the revenue you could expect to come in for public, for private, and so on. And that makes it a lot easier to start these schools. In terms of the data, I'll speak to this more a little bit later in the talk, but the short answer is, to go from one to a few, we didn't actually need a whole lot of hard data to suggest that this was a good idea. I mean, I loved it. The other families loved it. There was a wait list. There were like 100 people who were applying to the school for like 2 open slots. And so it made sense to replicate it. The qualitative metrics were there. And we're now in the process of kind of understanding. And also there's just lots of more scientific study on Montessori in and of itself, which suggests that Montessori should be much more widely spread. And then what we're doing is we're in the process of, as we get to scale, we can take this data and have more quantitative large-scale studies about different aspects. Things like one of the things that, so a number of studies have shown that Montessori, there's 2 things that come out of Montessori. One is both an increase, it comes out higher on cognitive measures, but the children come out higher on socio-emotional measures. And I believe that a lot of it is because of the same thing, is because Montessori provides a meditative environment by which children can get into flow and maintain that flow for a long period of time. And so we're in the process of doing studies on, for example, doing GSR studies on the children, galvanic student response studies on the children, to see what does and heart rate variability studies to see, do they actually get into flow? How long do they maintain flow? What happens in the environment to promote that, and so on. So there's all of these studies, but it needs more. We now have at the number of schools that we have, we're just starting to be able to kind of have these studies with an N that's high enough for us to feel comfortable.
So besides you studying the data, how does, it seemed like one big thing was how the teachers could use the data in changing how they teach it. Is there a result there of something you saw that's really...
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the biggest things that we see teachers using is things like how much time they're spending with each child. So they say, I could spend a little bit more time with this child today. Or things like the graph that I showed you with someone not interested in math until later in the year. Montessori is child-directed, so it's up to the child to do it, but it's up to the teacher to link the child to the environment. So a lot of times they can say, oh, let me link the child more to math at this point. So those are two ways that we see very much teachers using the data. So we created a social process by which other children, other people can start wildflower schools. And then we created software to enable that social process. So we started creating things like interactive maps that show the density of children in the city. And then optimization algorithms that show, given where the existing schools are and where the children are in the city, where are optimal places to put new schools. And then we're feeding that into user-facing software to understand what are the shop fronts available in the areas where schools are most needed. And then we're creating things like, okay, well, given the number of students in your budget, what are the materials that you should buy in order to start the school? And then things like a social network to allow teachers who are interested in starting schools connect with parents who are interested in starting schools. So what we did here is actually very similar to what we did in the wall drawings. We started by creating a physical pattern, a pattern in physical space. Then we created a social process by which other people could replicate that pattern or make similar patterns. And then we created software to enable that social process. And the result was that in the 2.5 years since we started the first school, 15 more wildflower schools have started. And we're finding that each school tends to spawn 2 more wildflower schools. And this was remarkable. I expected that this would grow, but I didn't expect that it would grow as fast. It reminded me of a story, a conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's an acupuncturist. And I was talking to him, and I said, so how does it work? How do you heal people? And he says, Sep, I don't heal people. The body's energies have the ability to heal itself. But sometimes those energies are blocked. And my role is to unblock those energies. And I thought that that was beautiful, and it was profound, and I think it's true at a level of scale above as well. I think people have the ability to heal their own societies, but sometimes the energy is blocked. And we can play a role of unblocking those energies by making things easier. And it's obvious, I think, that if you make something easier to do, more people will do it. But what's less obvious is how sensitive that relationship is. Like, if you make something just a little bit easier to do, lots more people do it. It's like, I remember when I was at Google, we would make a button just a little bit more visible, and millions more people would click on it. And so we could write software to serve as an acupuncture for society by making certain things easier to do, and then therefore unlocking the intrinsic potential of people to heal the world around them. And I think that is obvious that the software that I showed, the technologies that I showed, are self-limiting technologies. They work to create a school that no longer needs those technologies. They kick off a social process that no longer is so dependent on the technologies. But what's less obvious is the schools themselves are also self-limiting technologies. If you take a look closely at what we've been doing, we've created a school which is led by the child rather than the teacher. In radically mixed age environments where children of multiple ages and adults are working side by side, as opposed to kind of age-separated environments. In public spaces that are prepared for learning, rather than having the place of learning be separate from the place of the rest of life. With a social network that mixes teachers and learners, eventually teachers and learners of all kinds. So what we've been doing is we've been creating a kind of school that in the success case will need less of itself because the whole city becomes a place of learning. And I think that would be a beautiful result. So, thank you. Yes. Yes, sir.
About this franchising process, right? Like you have the processes and instructions, but obviously, like what a school is going to be like is going to be very much dependent on people that are in there, right? So I'm wondering, like, these 15 different branches that have like, do they do things slightly differently? Like are there like metrics like as good or better than yours? Have you been like incorporating their changes upstream?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And so certainly the intent is for each school to be different, to share the same philosophy and values, but not to be like McDonald's, not to be carbon copies of one another, but rather to take the personality of the teachers and the children and the parents who comprise the school. And so we aim for schools to be different. It's not that we even have to aim for it. They naturally become different. So for example, one is like one of the schools in Cambridge is a bilingual school, Spanish-English. Another that is very nature-based. I mean, they spent a lot of their time in nature because it started out with the teachers and then it attracted families who are into it, you know. So there are schools that end up being more heavily special needs because that's more of an interest of the teachers who started that school and so on. So variability is a good thing in an ecosystem, and we want to preserve that. I think there's a second question, which is, well, how do you know? I mean, if so much of the quality of a school depends on the people, how do you know whether a school will be good enough quality in order to maintain the brand, so to speak? And that, to me, is a branding question. So the way that we think about it is we say, everything will make open source so that anybody can use the tools to build a school if they'd like. But in order to be called a Wildflower School, in order to have the brand, you need to go through a certification process. And we're in the process of putting together that certification process. Yes?
That was amazing. I'm really curious about the Artists in Residence program.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned that adults can learn a lot from kids and kids can learn a lot from adults. Was there a choice made to say like, oh, we should have the artist in residence as opposed to some other kind of profession in residence? And are the artists creating works that interact with the kids, or like what are they doing on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, the artist in residence is a term, but I mean there are other people in residence. The important thing for me is that they work with their hands, because that allows children to observe what they're doing, especially in the younger years. In the older years, I think it's fine to have a computer programmer in residence. So that's kind of how we made that's how we kind of made that decision and gave guidance to the schools. In terms of how they work, yes, I mean, absolutely. So Kim, for example, did a gallery show in which it was both her work and the work of the children in the school, which was a lovely, beautiful show. But also what it turns out is that a lot of the artists end up getting inspired and interested by the children, you know. So Kim, for example, has been doing a lot of thinking about making a lot of Montessori materials based on her time there. And Ramel, who was one of the artists at the other school, started to get interested in, and he's a filmmaker, doing movies that are directed by children. So you just, whatever they say, you actually do. And so there's been a lot of cross-play between the two. It's been beneficial for both. Yes, Michael?
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the line between software and people. Mm-hmm. When designing social computing systems, my observation has been that people trained in computing and computer science seek to sort of scale and automate. Like, you know, it follows a similar pattern where we identify patterns in how the world works. We sort of identify a script, so to speak, or a workflow that encapsulates that, and then we say, okay, now everyone can do this.
Yeah.
And in practice, you know, or I'm sorry, in theory, I think the belief is that, you know, now it scales, it's beautiful, it works. But in practice, I think a lot of social phenomena really are social in that you can't be so hands-off about them. Uh-huh. And so I'm wondering if, as you think about this, or maybe I should give an example, like, you know, any NGO, right, mm-hmm. tries to go and, you know, make a difference in some environment, yeah. right? But, you know, when their funding runs out, like, and the people have to leave, it's actually the people who are on the ground who are actually key to making it happen. So I'm wondering, as a social computing designer, where do you sort of put your faith in the process, and where are you putting it in the people, and is there some like linchpin that's halfway in between that's sort of mediating it and keeping things tied together?
Yeah. I think I think part of the answer to that is that it's important in designing these systems to not think of ourselves as, or for me to not think of myself as a social computing designer. Because if I think I do that, I will overweight the amount of computing that is done and necessary. Instead, I think about myself as a gardener. And I'm trying to plant and shape and initially weed and then step back from ecosystems that themselves have tremendous intrinsic richness and intrinsic potential. And so my job is more like a Kickstarter of those. I call myself often, in the context of Wildflower, like the second person in a two-person bobsled. Like, I'll push a lot at the beginning and then step in and enjoy the ride. Um, and so I think kind of my high-level answer is when I mean, even the words designing and systems are fraught. They're almost too industrial for when we're trying to kind of seed ecosystems. And so I think once you do the framing of seeding ecosystems, then the kinds of tools that you build are tools like shovels or things that make it a little bit easier for the ecosystem to continue to grow and generate itself.
So if I were to put that another way, I think what you're saying is you build the social environments essentially bespoke yourself. You build the social world, and then once you have that, you start saying, well, wait, actually there are ways that technology can help us, amplify our efforts here.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the software we're building right now is so the first 10 schools we built with very little software at all. And then we realized, the teachers are really spending a lot of their time and stress on doing the finances in QuickBooks and understanding the finances. And is there a way we can build a tool to make that easier, given that the scope is limited? Or the teachers are spending an hour a day doing, an hour to two a week, just recording attendance for the week. And so there's a natural place for software. So the software is like light touch. It's not systemic. It's like tools in the, it's like gardening work. It's like tools in the ecosystem, basically. Of course, yeah.
I'm kind of curious about how you measure the interaction between the children. Do you just measure the distance between them and how long they stay together?
So right now with these sensors, it's just a distance. It's basically kind of we have a lower energy Bluetooth that pings once every few seconds. And so that's not clear that that's interaction. And we did a couple things. We ground truthed it by taking a look and saying, okay, when two children are close together within a couple feet from another, how often are they interacting versus not interacting? It turns out that the signal is strong enough, but there's a lot of work to do there. I mean, with computer vision, with voice recognition, and so on and so forth. So this is really a first step. Yes.
Bluetooth data, do the teachers still find themselves taking written notes, or do they mostly not do that anymore?
No, they do, and it's really important. It's really important that we don't. Observation is so central to Montessori that we don't want to say, oh, you don't have to do this thing anymore. It's kind of like saying, well, I'm going to build you these artificial legs that allow you to not have to walk anymore. But then your actual legs will atrophy, and it would be a shame for that. And so we view the same way here, and we do very close observation of the teachers and the interaction between the teachers and the tools to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Love the idea of self-limiting technology. How does it play a role in the world of capitalism?
You know, I would argue that there are, like, a search engine is a self-limiting technology as well. Like, if you find what you need, you don't need to use it again for that purpose. I would argue that there are, uh, like, they can fit very well with capitalism, but with one caveat. I mean, one of the reasons why search is such a good business is that it actually overtook a lot of other advertising businesses, so it was able to be self-limiting without, and not self-reinforcing because it had such wide scale. So it didn't need to compete with, say, a newspaper for the amount of time somebody is spending on it because it had a 2 billion person reach. So I think what you'll see is you'll see kind of like certain things reaching their, like, and I'd argue the same, like a bicycle is a self-limiting tool in another way. Like, you can only ride so much in a bicycle before you get tired. But if a company like puts out bicycles that then overtake most car production in the world, then that company will do very well, even though there is creative destruction in the auto industry on that front. I think in large part, I mean, one can say that maybe at the root is that a system in which the origination of money happens through debt that has that requires growth is itself not self-limiting. So, so it's interesting to think about self-limiting tools for money. And I think there's been lots of glimmers of interesting things happening here. One example is negative interest. And so, like, during the Great Depression, there were these, in order to boost the economy, what happened during, like, the Depression and depressions in general is money wasn't circulating. And because money wasn't circulating, it just stagnated, like it made the Depression worse. And so in order to get money circulating, they introduced these things called stamp script, which is negative currency, negative interest money, where, like, every week it would be worth a little bit less than it was the week before, and therefore people started spending money, and that kickstarted the economy. And you saw this happen in various local places with local currencies. I mean, one might imagine that negative interest might actually happen on its own. We're at almost a zero interest environment right now, and it's not a big reach to say that at some point that might become negative interest just through economic dynamics. So I suspect that we could also see self-limiting capitalism, and that would be interesting. That's a longer conversation to have, but that would be interesting to talk about offline. Yes.
How do you think this model of schools with shopfront schools and all this applies to like larger or higher grade levels?
So we have one high school, and the high school was really interesting because, in the younger grades, it's like some combination of teachers or parents who starts the school. In the high school, it was the kids. And for kids to start their own school is this amazing, amazing experience that's probably a stronger life experience than going to the school. I think so I have I gave a whole talk on what I see as the future of university, and I'll give like a 2-minute summary right now. And I think this is also true, like what I'm saying for university is also true for high school. But basically, I said the first thing is, like, the internet changes things in ways that are not necessarily obvious at the beginning. They're not the obvious answer to how the university will change things, how the internet will change things. So one thing is, I think the internet will change things by getting rid of degrees. And the reason why is because a degree is a proxy for knowing something, for learning something. But right now, with the internet, you don't need a proxy. You could just do the thing and put it online. And so people will stop going to university to get a degree, but instead go to university to build a portfolio. The second thing I said in the talk was that, and the analogy that I used was the Green Bay Packers. So the Green Bay Packers used to be meat packers during the week, and then on the weekends they would play football. What happened between the beginning and now? And what happened was television. And so television made football into a business that could scale. And as a business that could scale, it made sense to disaggregate meatpacking from football and invest in the football. And so you had people going full-time, you had people really like working hard at the football. And I think a similar thing will happen with lectures. So instead of thousands of people lecturing to hundreds of people, we'll have hundreds of people lecturing to thousands of people. And lectures will become a resource like books or so on that people have access to. So I said there would be no lectures, and instead there will be like a resource library of lectures that people could use. And then I said the third thing is I said, but it's still useful to have classes. It's just those classes will start to look different. They'll start to look like ateliers and reading groups and workshops and so on. And so it would look like MIT has this period called IAP, Independent Activity Period, and my feeling was that it will look like IAP year-round. And those courses could be, those workshops and ateliers could be initiated by faculty, they could be initiated by students, they could be, and they could be like a semester long, or they could be a year long, or they could be a week long. And so you have this kind of fluid, organic learning environment at the university level that looks like MIT's IAP. And then what I say is, I say, you notice that I've been starting to kind of blur the boundary between student and faculty. Like faculty don't give lectures, students can initiate lectures, there's no degrees and so on. And so what I said is, instead of like this student distinction, you'll have everybody as a fellow. And fellows can come for 4 years, or they could come for like 2 days a week for the rest of their life, or they could come for 6 years or 1 year or so on. And so you have this fluid. So basically kind of my feeling is that for the higher grades from high school and college, it will look student-directed with lots of resources like IAP. Yes?
Just thinking of the acupuncture analogy and the blockage that you were talking about, have you, as you continue to scale up, have you had any kind of pushback from Cambridge public schools or Boston public schools?
No, in fact, we have had interest. I mean, one of my big interests is creating public wildflower schools. And so of the 15, 4 of them are public. And my interest is that number far outweighs the private wildflower schools. I started with private just because they're easier to start. So by and large, I mean, it actually solves a lot of problems for public districts. I mean, so for example, like Cambridge has a Montessori school that has a huge waiting list, but they're not going to start another big school. They don't have the facility space, but they can start a shop front, you know. And so there's interest. I mean, we're starting our first public school in the Boston area next year, and so I imagine that I mean, my intention is to have a model of education that all people can use, regardless of whether it's public or district or charter or private, and regardless of the means of the families who are enrolled at the school. Yes, John.
Last question. So yeah, wonderful work. I'm wondering, so I think here you talked a lot about the design patterns that you've used to implement these specific instances of these social, social interventions, and then also the self-limiting technology. And I'm wondering if you've thought or could speak to a little bit about, do we need tools in order to make these systems? Because right now I imagine you're making this bespoke system that has the social network component, that has these different components. What do you think are the right tools to enable other people, or does it really need to be this bespoke gardening process?
In fact, like I see it as a stack. And I remember when I came to MIT, the vision was to have the stack all the way from the built environment down to the programming language. The mistake that I made was that I started with the programming language, but then when we started building the applications, I was like, all right, the programming language, the application should be built first so we know the requirements for the programming language. And so I shifted and started then with the built environment, and we're working our way down. So programming languages, I think, is where, like domain-specific programming languages to make it easier to build these kinds of things is where I see the tools to build tools.
All right, let's thank Sep
Great.
for coming up.
Thank you.